My apologies. I had to come back on. I had to come back on because in my first breakdown, I had a component in there that didn't get caught. And I lost it. And then when I did the second one, I forgot to mention this one. And it's imperative that I mention this one because I think it's very important when we start talking about understanding the magnifier and the exhorter. Ah, man, I can't believe I left that out the last time. Well, that's what happens when you're relying on social media. Things just happen like that. So this one is not even going to be long. But I just wanted to come back in and say something about the worship leader. I wanted to say something about the worship leader because many times when people want to talk about the worship leader, their go-to reference is, well, they'll say Lucifer before the fall was the worship leader of heaven. And he was the leader of the angels in worship. And I just wanted to have this on record that there is not one place in Scripture that says that. There's not one place in Scripture that it says, I'm not going to refer to him as Lucifer because that's a whole different teaching. There's also not a Scripture that says that Lucifer was his name before the fall. Now, I know you would go to Isaiah 14 when the prophet is speaking to the king and says, how art thou fallen, O Lucifer? But you got to understand that whole thing in the context of that it was being said. But I'm not here to argue or to debate on whether we want to call him Lucifer before the fall. But I want to say that whole teaching from connecting the composite or the collection of our stories about who Satan was. If we go from Genesis with the serpent in the garden, or if we go from Ezekiel 28:18, and we give that whole composite of the anointed cherub, and then we go to Isaiah 14, and then if we go over and then we see his activities in dealing with Christ in his earthly ministry. And then when we go over to Revelation, the book of the Revelation, or if we look even in Jude where he's battling with Michael over Moses' body. But all of the scriptures that we want to go to, or even Job, if we go to Job and we want to connect Job, the story of Job and how he had access to the throne, and Yah says, have you considered my servant Job, and all that. So I know all the scriptures in regards to what we use to say this is who Satan was before the fall, this is who he is now. But I want to say there is no backing. There's no scripture that talks about he was the worship leader or he was the choir director. So all that's wrong. It's wrong. Now, in Ezekiel 28, you see where it talks about the pipes that are in him. And you could argue with the pipes in him. You could argue for the fact, or the tabrets built into his frame. Now, that can mean a lot of different things. But let's just say you could argue at the most that he could be musical. And if there are pipes in him that, just like we have pipes in us, that wind can flow through us. And so we are able to create waves and make sound waves. And so you could even say that everything that he creates with pipes or with the ability to produce wind can be musical, can be creative beings. But to take that and say, well, he was the worship leader, that's wrong. So that puts added suspicion on a carnal worship leader to say that they are closer to satanic temptation or closer to satanic attack than any other creative being. But if you look back at Ezekiel 28, you'll see more so than it's saying anything about him being a worship leader in terms of, and I don't want to say he wasn't a worship leader, he wasn't a choir director, but you will see that he oversaw, that he had an oversight of sanctuaries. He defiled his sanctuaries, the scripture says. And we know that he was involved in business, and it said, but by trade, it's talking about the old world, but that he did trade by violence. So he defiled the sanctuaries, and he operated in trade by violence, or that which is vile. So he would have been more, it would have been more accurate to say that he was like a bishop, or more accurate to say that he was like a merchant, a bishop and a merchant, an overseer of sanctuaries that housed assemblies of created beings, and one who trafficked the glory, whatever the glory of Yah was manifested at that time. But he did it with violence. He did it with cruelty. He did it with brutality. That's a whole nother message. But I just want to say that, but there is no scripture that talks about Satan being, or Lucifer being, the worship leader in heaven before the fall, or the choir director in heaven before the fall. We know that he was an anointed cherub, but he wasn't the only anointed cherub. There are other cherubim, you might say cherubim. There are other cherubim. Whenever you see the cherubim outside of the mention of him, of the prophet addressing him, Ezekiel addressing Satan, you see them operating in teams. You see them in teams guarding the garden from entrance when Adam and Eve were kicked out. You see them in teams and in pairs when they're at the Ark of the Covenant, when they're on the Ark of the Covenant looking down into the mercy seat. You see them as teams in pairs when they're on the curtains of the temple. You see them in teams and pairs in Ezekiel, in the beginning of Ezekiel, when they're moving together, and it has the imagery, the symbolic imagery of the different heads, the oxen, the human head, the eagle, and the lion. You see that. And then you see, so anywhere that you see the cherubim represented, you see them operating as a team. So we have exalted Satan a lot of times in folklore beyond measure, and given him a place like he was the fourth member of the Godhead. And somehow that those who are in carnality and they play an instrument, or they're, operating in that, they're on a whole different level, because that's Luciferian. Well, that is just plainly wrong, because I'm going to tell you, it doesn't matter. Anybody who operates in the strength of whatever it is, if they operate in the strength of that, then it's Luciferian, not because it is Satan before the fall, but it's Luciferian because Satan influences kings and sovereigns and rulers, and he influences them to want to put themselves up to be like God. And let me make a brief distinction between Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. In Ezekiel, the cherubim are on the plain or on the mountain with Yah. And in Ezekiel 28, it's talking about a spiritual being, because this being is talked about, you were in the garden. So it's not talking about a natural person. You were in the garden. The precious stones were built into you. And the depiction of this being lets you know that this was a being who walked the coals, was at the throne of Yah, right there with him on his throne. So that means he was up there on the throne with him, circling the throne, being a cherub. But then if you look at Isaiah 14, it says, "Oh, how art thou fallen?" But it says, "You fallen because you said in your heart, I will be like God. I will ascend." So this is a natural king, a natural being who is trying to ascend and be like God. And it's something that is known in the ancient world, with ancient cosmology, that the kings were represented as, or they were looked at as, the offspring of the gods. But in order to ascend to that level, they had to do something great. They had to be great. They had to do something magnificent, expand the borders of their kingdom, their territory, so that when they died, they will ascend into to be like the gods or be the most adorned of the gods, which was really for them their ancestors, the previous kings from the royal dynasty or whatever. But my main point with that is let's not elevate Satan, whatever his name was, because Lucifer was not a name. It was to talk about that you are a superstar. Oh, how are you fallen, oh superstar? This is sarcastic language toward a boastful king who thinks that he's greater than God. How are you fallen, oh superstar? You thought that you would be able to ascend, yet you're going to die like men. And you're not only going to die like men, they're going to be like, is this the one that deceived the nations? Is this the man that they said that had all the nations shaken up? Is this the man? But you're going to be in the grave. So Satan. So if you look at the language that is given and the edicts that are given toward the person in Isaiah 14, it lets you know that this is a being that is elevated, who is influenced demonically, influenced by Satan, which makes him Luciferian. But the subject itself is not Satan directly. Whereas when you look at Ezekiel 28, you see that there's a difference there. And also look at the distinction between the prince of, or the king of Tyre, the prince of Tyre, the king of Babylon. Those things are different. And then you have different authors. So anyway, I didn't mean to get into all of that. Just know that a person, what I was going to get back to, a person who is strong in any gift, whether it's a creative gift of craftsmanship, can be just as dangerous, or a strong in irons work, in that kind of work, ironsmith, or a blacksmith, someone that's strong in that could be just as dangerous as someone who knows how to play the piano, or even worse. Someone who's strong in the gift of administration could be more dangerous than someone who can sing and hit a high note or hit a Barry White note. So there's nothing extra demonically, there's no extra demonic proclivity towards Satan for the worship leader. For the worship leader. You could have a gift of speaking and be more dangerous, the gift of teaching, and be more dangerous than the person who knows how to play 5 instruments. So that's an unrealistic thing that we put on musicians, because we thought, and somebody taught us, that Satan was the worship leader. And so the music arena, the music area, the music industry even, is more perverse, because that's what he was prior to the fall. But I don't know how many actual wars broke out because of music. But I know some wars that broke out because of leadership. I know some wars broke out because of businessmen and because of money, because of somebody being a merchant. I know wars have broken out because of people who were involved with politics. And so it seems like the proclivity towards warfare and destruction and mass destruction of life a lot of times ends up being in those arenas. Not saying that the music realm and the creative realm is not important, but we just need to go back, revisit all that, restudy your whole breakdown of Lucifer and his name and his previous role as the choir director. See where you really see that at in Scripture. And if I'm wrong on that, hit me up and let me know. I just wanted to make sure I put that in there. That should have been in the other teaching. But I'll talk to y'all later. Grace and peace. Talk to you soon.